Hello and welcome back to the Minisode. This is Penny Sansaberry and Amy Cornell, and this is the Book Marketing Tips and Author Success Minisode podcast. So today, this is a topic that has, and Amy and I were, when we were talking before we started recording, we were mentioning how this could be a much broader conversation, but we want to try to keep this to the Minisode structure, and we can certainly elaborate on it later. But there are a lot of tethers to this conversation in terms of hanging your star or anchoring your book to something that is part of a news cycle that's trending and almost at an end, right? Which I guess is, or even seasonally, or something that is already past.
Yes. Exactly. I think this happens a lot, Penny, and we get a lot of authors that come to us, and while they're explaining their book, and to give them some credit, a lot of times it happens because they're very passionate about a particular topic.
Yeah.
It's something that means a lot to them or something that they have experience with, and they use that to kind of fuel how they structure their book and their storyline and things like that, without realizing that it can end up being very limiting when it comes to quickly and easily being able to translate that to a potential buyer, because we've talked about in a recent episode how, if you can't get somebody excited about your book in less than 10 seconds, then you're probably going to have a hard time converting that shopper into a buyer once they land on your Amazon page, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what gets lost a lot of times when you're dealing with, like you said, timely news topics, things that are trending. There's a lot of social and political issues that end up getting roped into this that, again, authors feel passionate about and they want to work it in because it means something to them, not realizing that when you're on that next phase where you're trying to market your book and share the appeal with people, that not only they may not fully get it, to the extent that if you make them think too hard, they're just not going to buy. We'll just put that right out there. If they have to start thinking about it, you've lost them already.
Right.
And then there's that other element of potentially turning off a broader reader base because you are so hyper-focused on projecting this very specific element of your book that you lose people that normally might really love what you've written under a typical circumstance, if it was presented to them in a slightly different way.
Right, exactly. I think that where it gets tricky is that authors may start with the concept of, I'm going to write something. Let's just use the pandemic, right? I'm going to write something about the pandemic, and it's going to be a great story about whatever. Okay. By the time the book comes out, God willing, this will be. We said this I remember in March, I'm like, wow, 2 weeks to slow the spread and we'll be done. And then a year later, here we are. But at the same time, you have to consider how long will this news cycle last, right? So as you are thinking about what you're going to anchor your story to, is the news cycle already moving on? Are we moving on from that story? And it's amazing. It is absolutely mind-blowing how fast the news moves on from stuff, right? It really is so amazing. Being aware of things that may be at an end when your book launches, let's say in the fall, right? Are lockdowns still going to be part of the conversation? Are we going to be back to normal or more than normal? Are people really going to want to talk about it?
Right. It's going to be that thing that nobody wants to discuss anymore, and then you're really screwed.
I already get annoyed when TV shows incorporate mask wearing. Not that I'm don't wear masks. I get it, but I'm can I just watch this TV show and have it just be normal, right?
Right. It's my fantasy time. I want to escape from the real world.
This is my vacation time. I just want to forget what's going on. So I think that it's a much broader conversation, I realize, in the compressed time that we have. But really thinking about, and you gave an example of, Amy, when we were talking before the show about a historical fiction book, and the author really wanted to anchor it to PTSD, but it wasn't really about PTSD, right?
Yeah, it was, and he had a lovely cover, and it was about a soldier that was a child during World War II. It was actually a series, and it was an awesome biographical historical fiction novel. But he really felt, the author itself, going back to that, he felt really passionate about bringing to light the PTSD element of what this individual in the book, the soldier, went through and things like that. But there wasn't enough of it in there to where letting PTSD be the primary focus of how that book should be marketed. Really, it didn't make any sense in that regard, because there's a lot of historical fiction lovers out there and those that read the book reviewed it very positively, but nobody, caught on to that PTSD element as much as the author had envisioned, if that makes sense. So
yeah, absolutely.
That was a real challenge when it came to marketing it, because, we had to kind of push back a little bit and say, listen, we're going to start this with historical fiction fans because we think they will really like this book. But if we beat them over the head with this PTSD element, we're going to run into people that are like, well, that's not really my thing,
Right.
So we had to be really careful, and it was a delicate dance, and fortunately he trusted us, and it ended up, doing pretty well. But it's a good example of how tricky it can get, and how you have to be very strategic when you have elements like that, especially in fiction, I think, where people they're not expecting an update, oh, here's the 2021 edition of my fiction novel, updated to fit the current news cycle. It's like, that's not exactly the plan with fiction,
Well, but the other thing though too is that if I had just, obviously we worked with this author, so we loved the book, but if I had just happened on this book, I love World War II historical fiction, I probably would have said, I don't know if I want to get into one person dealing with PTSD. So keep in mind, and then if I, had picked up the book and I would have seen that it was maybe only 10 or not even 20% of the story, be careful what you anchor your story to, because sometimes the anchor can actually sink the ship, right? So be mindful of both big, broader messages that you anchor to, as well as things that are, frankly, passing, news cycles that are, news cycles that are going to shift. For example, when we're recording this, so Larry King died over the weekend, and there are a few Larry King books that are being pushed out there, and I'm seeing them sort of on Amazon. But sadly, in another week, we'll have moved on. So if you're sitting there writing your book about Larry King thinking, I'm going to get this book out there are going to be fans of his that are going to want to read it, but it isn't going to be a top news cycle anymore. Does that make sense?
That's a very good point, Penny. And again, we predicted that this conversation could go on much longer, but I think you make a very good point that these elements that we're talking about that can be very tricky, be strategic and be prepared to use them as ways that you want to pitch, maybe for interviews and things like that when it is timely.
Yeah.
And then be prepared to shift away from those when it's time, and have a new way to present the book or a different way. So I think testing those elements works much better in very specific pitching that you may do versus your overall kind of marketing plan for your book.
Yeah, I agree with that. Thank you again so much for tuning in. This is Penny Sansevieri and Amy Cornell, and this is the Minisode, the Book Marketing Tips and Author Success Podcast. Bye-bye.